Good afternoon from Singapore, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to our panel discussion on the global circular economy. I'm Jessica Chiam, Managing Director of Eco-Business, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. This panel is co-presented by SGInnovate and the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development. It is part of the Deep Tech Summit at the Singapore FinTech Festival and Switch 2020. I'd first like to thank SGInnovate and UNDP for the kind invitation to moderate this discussion, which touches on a critical topic that has in the past been underreported, but is being put on the agenda of governments and businesses worldwide today. For those who have joined us, the circular economy is defined as an economic model which eliminates waste and seeks the continual safe use of natural resources. It is restorative and regenerative by design. If anything, COVID-19 has put the spotlight on the link between human health and that of our natural world, and the critical need for us to be responsible stewards of our precious resources. So to enable us to tackle our pressing challenges of resource scarcity, pollution, and climate change, we urgently need to move towards a global circular economy. So it's wonderful to see it being put on the agenda here at the Deep Tech Summit, which is in line with this year's theme on the power of science and technology innovation to build a more resilient and sustainable energy future. Today, we will speak with some of the leading voices from a range of organizations on why a global circular economy is important and how various stakeholders should work together to advance this agenda. I am privileged today to be joined by an esteemed panel, and I will introduce them now. We have with us Antonia Gawel, Head of Circular Economy and Innovation and member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum, Calum, Handforth, Advisor, Digitalisation and Smart Cities at the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development, David McGinty, Global Director, Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, also known as PACE, and Dr. Mohammad Farahani, Founder and CEO of Sepio. Welcome, speakers. Thank you for joining us today. No doubt we'll have an exciting discussion ahead, so I'd like to get started. Tonya, if I could just invite you to first share your thoughts. The World Economic Forum issued a recent report that estimated that the circular economy can yield up to $4.5 trillion in economic benefit to 2030, while helping the world achieve its climate targets. So are you seeing businesses capitalize on this opportunity? And where, in this journey is the world right now?
Great, thanks, Jessica, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Maybe just to answer your question first and foremost, yes, businesses are starting to capitalize on the opportunity of the circular economy, but not quite enough. And that's really why I think at the World Economic Forum, we're quite keen to really promote this opportunity and this agenda, because we do see it as an incredible economic opportunity. As you said, $4.5 trillion estimated by 2030, which actually comes from some work that a partner of ours, Accenture, has developed, because there are so many wasted resources in our system, right? So you think about the scale of throughput of materials that we've arrived at today, it's phenomenal, right? So take textiles, fabric, for example. We now live in a world where consumers have doubled the consumption of clothing, for example, and that is expected to increase going forward. So this disposability, we're dumping about one dump truck of plastics in the ocean every second. The rate of consumption has really skyrocketed, and that has therefore resulted in an incredible increase in extraction of natural resources. The other dynamic here, though, is that the productivity of resources has decreased, right? So for every unit of resources that we're extracting, we're getting less value, less economic benefit into our system, into our economies. And that just doesn't make any sense. We have all these technologies, we're innovating, but we're becoming less efficient when it comes to using natural resources. It's just counterintuitive. So I think our mission really and goal here is to help businesses, help people understand that this system has kind of gone a little bit, well, really too far in terms of mass consumption to the detriment of both the environment, but also actually our economies, both in terms of valuing the resources that we have in the system, but also in terms of the impact that it's presenting on the environment. And this is a risk, right? So you mentioned And I think it's becoming increasingly recognized that the connection between natural resources and climate is huge. About half of the CO2 emissions are resulting from the extraction, processing, and use of natural resources. So there's a fundamental connection in these systems, and we know that climate change is a fundamental risk of our time. So I suppose in sort of summary, in short, there are many reasons for us to really be thinking about our system. It's about the economy, it's about the resources, and it's about the risks of not doing something presents, as well as the positive economic opportunity that we see. So more action from our perspective can only benefit all of us.
Thank you so much, Antonia. I'm going to come back to you on the steps that we can take in terms of action. But before that, I'm going to go to Calum. Calum, the UNDP Global Center for Technology and Innovation is helping to speed up this transition to the global circular economy by catalyzing public-private partnerships. Can you share some successful examples that you have seen and also perhaps some lessons that you've learned along the way?
Definitely. Thank you, Jessica. And again, thank you for the invitation. To echo, I think everything that Antonia said there, I think all hugely important points and elements that we see in all of our work as well. I think what we're trying to do in the context of public-private partnerships is two elements. The first is very much kind of working upstream. So working with policymakers, with companies to understand how we design manufacturing processes as well. How do we design policy environments and regulatory environments in a sustainable and useful way? And then the second element is working downstream at a kind of consumer level. So how do we look at things like behavior change and changing how people engage with the economy and how do they engage with sustainability in their lives as well? I think one of the challenges that we see in particular is that the circular economy to many seems such a huge concept, and actually finding an entry point sometimes can be quite tricky or quite daunting. What we try to do instead is really kind of highlight the importance of experimentation, piloting, just taking tentative steps in terms of changing behavior, whether as a firm, a government, or as an individual, and then building on those as well. I think the struggles that we've seen around the world so far are trying to adopt something wholesale and then it failing because of the scale of change required. It does require significant change, but what we're finding is that in governments, in companies, and in individuals, it's very much a journey toward a circular economy. And sadly, will take a little bit of time, but we're definitely trying to support on that journey as well.
Thank you very much, Calum. I'm going to come back to you later, on what kind of specific steps companies can take. But I'd just like to come to David now. David, PACE has been at the forefront of pushing the circular economy. But if you look at the recent Global Circularity Gap report, it says that only 8.6% of the world at the moment is circular. And this is actually a drop from 9.1% 2 years ago. So in your view, what do you think are the main challenges that are preventing us from being more circular in our economy and our society?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Calum and Antonia have kind of previewed what some of those challenges are. We have a system, an economic system that's optimized for too small of a set of variables. And it needs to optimize for the combination of economic growth with improved environmental impacts and other outcomes. So when you do that, what circular economy does is it challenges you to reframe how you view the economy and really has as an underlying principle this idea of decoupling economic growth from the increased consumption of materials. So that addresses basic behaviors that have been positively rewarded in the economic system we have today, right? So in a lot of ways, you could say our economic model that we have since World War II has really worked. We've had massive growth, we've had increases we've had massive economic growth around the world. We've lifted a lot of people out of poverty. And also we've seen improvements in healthcare and other things, but it's come at a cost to the environment that is unsustainable. And so this circular economy, using it as a tool, really challenges us to look at our own behavior as consumers. It challenges us to look at how we reward businesses, what kind of policy frameworks we put in place. But I really think Calum's absolutely right. And it's quite interesting what you have here. I led innovation and technology for a company before my current role. You've got Antonia, who leads innovation and the circular economy within the Center for Global Public Goods at the Forum. You've got Calum, who leads innovation and technology. And I think that's exactly what's going to unlock scale in the adoption of circular economy is people who have an innovation mindset. Because it does take that iterative, really practical, get it done type approach. So the established businesses we work with and the governments that we work with tend to be very risk-taking. They want to be leaders in their markets. They want to be leaders within their regions or within their different specializations. And they're willing to kind of be first movers and bring people along. And as PACE, that's really, you could say we're a coalition of some of those first movers, really trying to create that momentum and challenge that Antonia was addressing, that we get over this barrier of not enough companies adopting the practices by partnering with leading companies who are going to show the way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to come back to you to cite some specific examples, but I'll go last but not least to Farahani. Technology obviously is the inevitable mechanism that enables us to become more circular. So tell us a little bit more about your company, Sepio, and what role does it play in enabling the circular economy?
Yeah, thank you so much. At SEPPURE, actually, we're replacing energy-intensive industrial chemical separation with a sustainable nanofiltration technology that helps industries like food, pharmaceutical, petrochemical, semiconductor, and even oil and gas to reduce their energy consumption and GHG emission by 90% and save 30 to 50% on their operating costs using our technology. So we're also helping industries to recover, recycle, and reuse valuable chemicals that currently either being incinerated or lost due to the lack of a proper method. So a lot of times when we look at industries like food, oil and gas, and pharmaceutical, we have a lot of processes that are thermal processes that use a lot of heat, and these processes are very energy intensive. So with Sepio's technology, we're replacing that, and we are doing that without use of heat, so we can actually save a lot on the energy consumption and GHG emission. On the other side, we have a lot of chemicals, especially in pharmaceutical industry, that are going to incineration, a lot of organic solvents, simply because we don't have an effective and efficient method to recover those solvents and make them clean to be reused and recycled. So with Sepio's technology, we can actually enable that and avoid a lot of incineration of these valuable chemicals.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm just going to open the discussion now, to the panel. I mean, we've heard, your views on the circular economy and what needs to be done. But can you really share some specific examples of companies that you think are successfully doing it today? What can we learn from them? Antonia, perhaps I can ask you with, we're doing a lot of work in the circular economy with companies around the world.
Yeah, happy to share a few examples. So let me maybe take two sectors just to kick off the thinking here. So one is electronics, e-waste. So 2 years ago, we put out a report in collaboration with a number of UN organizations, which kind of laid out basically the trends in the electronic sector when it comes to circular economy. And on one side, it's a positive story. On the other side, it's quite a frightening one. So e-waste is the largest growing sector of waste globally, which is unsurprising. We're all probably sitting in front of about 5 or 6 electronic devices at the moment. That's kind of the way that we're going, and how we continue to operate in the COVID context. So a positive thing, it's keeping us connected. The other side of that, though, is that what we found is that there's about $63 billion worth of value in unleveraged electronic waste every year. It's just sitting there. The challenge here, though, is that the kind of cost benefit of actually getting to those resources, extracting them and integrating them back into the system is not always necessarily aligned. There are, however, companies that have recognized this and are starting to take action. So we're working with companies like Dell, like Philips, like Apple, and a number of others who have either set very clear targets to be able to integrate materials back into their production system from used electronic devices, as well as rethink the way that they design those products to be able to actually do that effectively. Because one of the things is that in the design, if you're not thinking about the recovery, it's going to be a lot harder to actually kind of recapture that material back into your system. I think it is worth, though, pointing out that there are challenges to actually doing this in practice. So one is the economics, right? So the distributed nature of a lot of these products makes it quite challenging actually to get back to, but it's not unsolvable. The other thing, though, is that to be able to actually implement this requires policy also to be aligned. So in a number of countries, for good reason, a lot of these materials and products, they are classified in some cases as hazardous waste. And so there are a lot of really careful regulations that have been put in place. But the flip side of that is it makes it really difficult to move these things back to production manufacturing sites. And so that's where we just need to sort of rethink a little bit a system that has, from a regulatory policy perspective, been designed to control for the management of dumping hazardous waste, to the safe recovery of materials to reintegrate into the systems as well. So that's just sort of one example. Plastics is another, right? So I mentioned the volume and scale of waste in terms of plastics that are going into our environment. And what we do see is kind of some of the, let's say, the biggest plastics users in the system setting quite firm targets now to recover all of that plastic, to be able to, again, make sure that it isn't having the hazardous impacts on the environment. But I do want to emphasize that's not enough. It's not just about waste. And this is the important thing about the circular economy. We need to look at the systems upstream. Why do we have so much plastic in our system? We need to eliminate as well, because we don't necessarily need all of this material in the system in the first place. So it's trying to kind of push those two, I would say, agendas. Yes, clean up the waste that's there, and there are companies that are leading on that: Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle. We're working with a lot of them in our Global Plastics Partnership, as well as rethinking the design of the way that we actually distribute goods and services, such that we don't necessarily need plastic material in the first place. So I would say there are some early movers, as David said. The question then is, how do we work as a partnership with them and other companies and them and government to actually change the incentives for the rest of the businesses who aren't necessarily going to move on their own as well?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Antonia. I think you've really made some very valid observations, especially on the recovery part. You know, a lot of organizations really struggle to recover their products and services to put them into the circular economy. And of course, policy needs to be aligned. So perhaps we can talk a little bit more broadly on regulation, because if you look at some regions, the EU, for example, they're very progressive on legislation around circular economy. Many of the countries have circular economy manifestos, particular leading on that. In Asia, a lot less of that, even though we're seeing that. Can you share some thoughts perhaps on whether you think that some moves that Asian governments can make to enable the circular economy here? Calum, perhaps I can pick on you from the UNDP.
Thanks, Jessica. So I think actually one potential leader in this area, in this region, is Indonesia. So our country officer is actually working with them to try and define a circular economy policy and strategy for the entire economy there. It's very much a kind of ongoing conversation, but I think there's real potential with that. But completely echo your point. This is very much about understanding how to get regulation to incentivize and work and support the companies that Antonia mentioned. I think sometimes what we see with governments is that they aren't too close to the mechanics or the understanding or the realities of the private sector. So often aren't familiar with supply chains, aren't familiar with all the complexities that Antonia's just mentioned. So actually sometimes our engagement is very much partnering between government and private sectors to provide a bit more insight on both sides in terms of actually how this regulation can incentivize and support a kind of transition to a more sustainable way of working and eventually towards the circular economy as well.
Wonderful. David or Farahani, would you like to add to perspectives on regulation?
Yeah, I'm happy to share some ideas. If you mentioned what's going on in Europe and with the European Green Deal, and if you take that as a template, and you can see what other countries are doing that are common, there are some incentives and policies in place that are becoming relatively consistently needed to enable the systems change. So if I just kind of name a few, one is looking at subsidies for the reuse of materials as well as taxes on waste. You've got to have both of those working in conjunction to create the market incentives. The second is actually having recycling strategies reinforced with actual investments in the infrastructure. So I think we can get caught up in the innovation and the shininess of the new business model, but you still need the fundamental infrastructure there to enable this flow. And that's missing even in some of the wealthiest countries of the world. The other is looking at in government procurement and the power of government procurement and how you can take total cost of ownership. So that means pricing in externalities into procurement and able to enable businesses to see the market signals and begin to invest in new products and services that are aligned to a circular economy. The other trend, and I'll say it quite bluntly, is looking to ban outright single-use plastics. And so we're seeing this as a common movement as the next level of ambition in the plastics work. And there's currently a call to the UN that will be considered at UNEA 5 within the UN Environment Program on whether there should be the establishment of a treaty around plastics, which would include something like this. And the last I'll mention is something a little controversial, and there's a lot of details here and 20 plus years of experience, but really seeing, if we look at those things I was talking about subsidies for reused materials and taxing waste and looking at total cost of ownership, that means that carbon pricing becomes critical, and we're really optimistic about some of how the political environment's possibly changing to open up the possibility for scaling these different alternatives for carbon pricing more.
Thank you very much, David. I think you make some very good points here, especially on subsidies and taxes on waste, because as we've seen from COVID-19, even that the cost of virgin plastic is so much cheaper than recycled plastic. And that has created absolutely no economic incentive for any companies to adopt circular economy approaches. Farahani, have you got any views on this?
Yeah, so I want to answer this from another angle. So I think policies and strategies are more likely to succeed if they're based on science. So scientists and policy makers, I believe, should work together, which is not easy also. So for scientists to be involved in that process, they also need new skills. They should learn how to actually conduct their research in communities or connect with policymakers and focus on complex issues from different perspectives. But if we could actually integrate this, make these policymakers and scientists work together, I think the strategies and policies is gonna be a lot better and can be adopted to effect the Sustainable Development Goals, and will actually improve people's life at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry, I just thought it might be interesting. I was building on what Calum said in terms of sort of leadership in the region, and also this idea which Farahani just mentioned in terms of that sort of partnership and linkage between these different communities, just to kind of maybe bring it down a little bit in terms of sort of a specific example again. So Indonesia, as Calum mentioned, is taking a leadership role in terms of the circular economy. So they've set a target to reduce marine debris by 70% by 2025, which by all measures is really, really difficult. And they themselves have said, look, we are not sure how to do this and how to achieve this target. And this is an example of where they came out to the international community, and we've been working with them for the past 2 years, basically to construct what Calum described and also Farahani described, is a public-private partnership at the very top level of government, of companies, right? So all of the big international companies operating in Indonesia, as well as the domestic producers, because there's an incredibly sizable amount of the plastics in the domestic market that are not actually coming from international consumers. So over 150 that kind of the leaders across the different ministries, the leaders across all of the different businesses, civil society, waste picker associations, coming together to say, look, how can we help the government achieve this target? It is bold, it is ambitious. And that's basically started, that sort of kick-started what is now a 1.5 year process to design collectively a fact-based assessment and analysis of how that can actually be achieved, and then mapping out exactly what the sort of investment requirements are, what the policy measures are, how that is actually quite different across the different parts of the country, because it's an incredibly complex archipelago. It's difficult actually to get a lot of these things from one place to another. So it's not easy to say, look, just ban everything. How are you going to get food to incredibly remote communities where they might not have cold storage, for example? So I think just this model of actually quite difficult, long, multi-year partnership to actually bring the players around the table help achieve an objective which is set at the national level, not coming in and saying, this is what you need to do. It's their objective, and the leadership that Indonesia has, I think, demonstrated on a global scale is what every single government should really be doing, and just being honest about the need to partner to actually achieve these objectives as well, because it's not something that any one stakeholder can actually achieve on their own either.
Absolutely. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. If I can just follow up and ask you, like, what was the impetus for Indonesia to, adopt such a cooperative model, and how can other governments be inspired to adopt that same approach?
I mean, I think the impetus really came from observation, right? So there was a very observable problem that was accumulating, in particular, given that Indonesia has a huge tourism sector, right? So there's an incredible tourism sector that, of course, is impacted when you see kind of piles and piles of waste, in the river systems, on the beaches. It's not exactly the sight that tourists wish to see. But also, actually, the Minister Luhut, has played an incredible leadership role in this regard, and he himself also recognized the links to human health, right? So he sort of really took a stance that actually, the plastic that is being ingested ultimately at the end of the day is not something that we want our people to suffer from. So there was definitely a leadership, I think, piece to this, in terms of individuals at senior levels within the government recognizing that this just was not a benefit, but then an openness to collaboration, and a recognition that, again, this isn't something that any one individual or government alone can achieve, and therefore kind of being open to bringing the pieces together. I would say a third thing is probably a bit of frustration. So I think one of the things that often happens in governments, in different markets, is that you have hundreds of people coming at you saying, I have the solution, work with me, take my money. And they said, look, like, we just want a partnership that brings everybody together. We want this to be somewhat structured, and we want to collaborate. Help us basically structure that, because otherwise we're just getting hit at from all sides. And so that's where I think kind of structured, open-minded governments, but also partners, right? So we have to move into a space where the agencies, the financiers, the technology solution providers are willing to collaborate towards the ultimate goal, rather than necessarily trying to kind of push their individual solution as well.
That's wonderful. Just staying on the Indonesia example, because it's so fascinating. I mean, what do you think was the hardest thing to get overcome in terms of getting buy-in? Because obviously you're talking about so many stakeholders. So was there a lot of education that was needed, or was it quite easy for everyone to get on board? Antonia or Calum, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I can very quickly, and it's an ongoing process, but Calum, go ahead.
No, I think what we've seen through our country office is firstly the importance of that kind of leadership that Antonia mentions, and having a kind of mandate to actually deliver this across the country. Because if it is such a key priority for your country, that is a very powerful kind of mobilizational factor for every level of government, society, and partners in the private sector as well. The other element I think has been really exciting to see and really important to see is also what Antonia mentioned a moment ago, the kind of openness and willing to learn, and being very honest that no one has this answer. Can we figure it out together? And I think often, and I spent a bit of time in government many years ago back in the UK, often it's very easy to be almost in a kind of siege mentality. You do not want to open yourself up to criticism, even if that could be through the mechanism of collaboration and engagement. It's a very scary thing to do. And I think with a government to actually very publicly say, help us here, figure out how we can do this together, how can we collaborate, how can we figure this out, is a really brave and important and quite inspiring thing.
Wonderful. Calum, just staying on you a second, because obviously UNDP is a multilateral platform for governments and partners to work on these issues. What do you think, about global standards of the circular economy? Is this something that's needed across the region? Because some of my observations, there's some greenwashing in the market where companies are claiming that they are circular, or that their products are greener than they are. For example, it's compostable, but only in very certain conditions. I mean, what are your views in terms of raising the standards of what it means to have circular products and services?
Yeah, no, you're completely right, Jessica. I think we do see a real struggle there. And I think this is symptomatic of an issue like the circular economy, which requires coordinated, global, and really kind of holistic actions. And so if you're one country, Indonesia or elsewhere, you're going to really struggle to affect change unless others in the ecosystem are also doing that same change as well. So I think that is definitely somewhere that the UNDP can play a role, whether it's through convening, sharing best practice, bringing people to the table, or even working with governments to highlight the relevance of all these to their economies, their societies, public health, and other elements as well. I think what we've seen as well is the Sustainable Development Goals are a really important factor here. Often we talk about the circular economy in the context of the environment, but when we start to dig into it, even in a very shallow way, we see, as Antonia mentioned, huge impacts on public health. We see better quality employment, higher quality jobs, higher value-added jobs, all hugely important to achieving the SDGs. I think the bigger challenge is going to be maintaining this kind of global standard. So you don't want, as you mentioned, greenwashing, you don't want to race to the bottom, but you also don't want a kind of regulatory shopping environment where companies are looking for countries with the lowest environmental standards to set up shop in. And I think that very much does require that kind of global engagement and global communication as well.
Very valid points. David, do you have anything to add on the global standards point of view?
Yeah, I mean, the ISO is working on standards right now around circular economy. There's also a lot of initiatives around different metrics and indicators for companies. You have some with WBCSD, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and others have those types of metrics. You see governments, both national in China, a lot of European governments, Chile, and others putting out kind of global circular economy strategies with metrics aligned to them. So there is a lot of move to standardize in that sense, in the way that data collection and metrics give you a way to standardize and focus your priorities. What I would say is we face a little bit of a fundamental issue around circular economy, and whether we're actually looking at a global circular economy as the goal, or we're looking at circular economy as a tool to achieve other goals. So is it an ambition in and of itself? And what I mean by the fundamental issue is that if you look at the UN's report on the 2030 agenda, where it looks through investments in the different SDGs, circular economy is most often kind of placed under SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production. We also don't have a understood definition of what sustainable consumption and production is. So we have a lot of ways to think about it. We have donut economics, we have planetary boundaries as kind of concepts. Those are quite abstract to then translate into policy or into a business model. And so we've seen, because of that lack of definition and other reasons, a significant underinvestment in sustainable consumption and production compared to other SDGs. So we really think it's important to show that transversal nature of the circular economy and how it actually is going to tangibly contribute to these other impact areas. So Calum was referencing decent work, economic growth, climate action, and you can also get lost in that. But they're different tools. So if you're coming at this and really looking at embedding circular economy into your climate action plans, that's going to give you a certain set of priorities for a country to focus on, and also areas to stimulate for business. So if you have a lot of built environment or infrastructure, or you're a high growth middle income country and you want to look at a lot more infrastructure investments, then you're going to want to have circular principles embedded into those investments. And that's going to help you manage your emissions, both embedded and new emissions. But if you're a high growth emerging or developing country that might not have that same infrastructure investment, you're going to look at decent work as both a positive reason for investment, but also a risk that you want to manage, because you're going to have a transition impact of certain industries while you get a positive benefit in the new markets that are being built. So I think the more we can get really specific about the metrics we want at a national level, related to the real local environment. Antonia was giving a great example of Indonesia. That's a very different case if you go to Chile, or if you go to Mexico, or you come to Europe. So those countries will have their own metrics and then prioritize certain actions related to those impacts. And I think that will then have that triggering effect to get greater investment and momentum in circular economy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I really like that point you made about there's no definition of what that means. And I think we all need to work towards, a common understanding of what it means to be circular. Farahani, I'm just going to come to you. I want to ask you, in terms of innovation and the startup ecosystem that you're seeing right now, do you think the support is there for startups to consider circular economy principles in, embedding that into the core of their business?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be good for the startup as well, because as long as they can actually make their products either recyclable or they reuse the raw material that they already have to recycle and create more value out of that. So it's going to be more beneficial for them, and I think this is something that the startups are looking into it from the very beginning. And for example, in our case, we have some standard still housing that we think that it's going to be recyclable for many times, and this is something that we can actually benefit from it. So it reduces our product cost, because at the end of the day we are going to collect it and recycle, and at the end of the day it's good for our customers to pay less for keep buying this, which has no use after sometimes for them. So I think for startups is as important as corporates, and it helps them reduce their costs and also be more efficient.
Do you think they get enough government support or support from other organizations at the moment? I mean, what can we do to help startups understand how critically important this is?
So the first thing is education. I think the education at the moment within corporates is basically government maybe is more engaged with big corporates, but when it comes to startups, there is no education for the startups to know whether they can actually do these kind of things better, and whether they can actually move towards circular economy, and whether they can recycle and reuse their materials or not. So I think it's good if you start with education and having some dedicated team to educate startups how they can actually apply this.
Just to put you on the spot here, has being circular in your business helped you to win more customers? Has it been profitable?
So we haven't actually scaled at the moment, so I cannot speak about profitability at the moment, because it's just the earliest stage of SEPPURE. But eventually, what I predict, it's going to be more helpful for us to, stick to this, recycling of a lot of our materials, and to make it more sustainable and more efficient. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Antonia, perhaps I can come to you, because you wrote recently that existing technology hubs don't always prioritize, finding long-term solutions to global problems, because it's not profitable. So, what do you think, we can do to help, I guess, remove the perverse incentives that actually make going into the circular economy more profitable for businesses?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So I guess in terms of innovation, startups, this is, I would say, the area that gives me the most hope and enthusiasm when it comes to the circular economy. From my perspective and looking, let's say, out, is actually it's these disruptors, innovators, entrepreneurs that are really leveraging the tools that we have today in terms of technology to be able to kind of come up with new ways of thinking. And I think, just perhaps before I answer the question directly, reflecting on what David and Caleb saying is, yes, kind of measuring today's circularity is important, but the mindset that circular economy provides us with is one that enables us to think about outside of the current system and the current silos, to say, okay, how can we actually rethink and do things completely differently, because we haven't necessarily thought of that approach in our current system. And this is where, again, the entrepreneurs and innovators really have an incredibly important role to play. So in terms of what can we do, so we run a program called Scale 360, which is all about how do you create what we call innovation ecosystems for the circular economy. I think it's important to recognize that there's something like 49 billion that has gone into big data. There's 36 billion that has gone into AI. That's because there's a market in those areas, and a lot of the investors and startups are funneling energy and money there, but those solutions are not related to the SDGs. They're related to all sorts of business applications and tools that consumers can use. And so the question is, how do you create the incentives and the sort of kind of opportunity for both investors to invest in sort of innovation related to the circular economy, but also that the entrepreneurs can play in that ecosystem? The answer is not simple. So we created a toolkit called the Scale 360 Playbook, and you have to look at the whole ecosystem. You need to understand what the innovation ecosystem looks like in a given area. And from our work, there's 25 different ways in which you can actually activate that ecosystem depending on what the system sort of baseline is, right? Are there government incentives and support for sort of targeted investment? Is there a market? Are there buyers for your solution? As an entrepreneur, of course, you're going to look at your market. Who's there? Who's going to buy my solution? Are consumers interested in this? So there's a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, but I think when it comes to fostering innovation, one of the areas that we're quite keen on is that this is a distributed movement, right? So of course you have tech hubs emerging in places like Singapore, in places like San Francisco, in Israel. How do we kind of distribute the focus on circular economy into these ecosystems? Because then you can have really this distributed economic gain, development of entrepreneurs who actually know the markets much better than anyone else. So that's where that sort of tech hub going into the ecosystems, assessing what's there, how do you support it, how do you scale it, again, for the circular economy, or frankly, any other SDG that we're trying to progress in the market, which may not necessarily today be the most logical place for young entrepreneurs to build their businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Antonia. I'm going to look up this Scale 360 Playbook right after, and I hope that people who are joining us can also check that out. Calum, I mean, you have any thoughts on this?
To echo Antonia, it is an enormous challenge. I think what we do see is the importance of things like guidance, playbooks, and similar in terms of actually setting this out. I think for startups as well, being able to see success is really important. So seeing others who have kind of been on that journey and can actually build a successful business, enterprise, or similar in the context of the circular economy is very, very important. Having done some work in startups before, and we also engage a lot with them at UNDP, it can be a very lonely place to be, and a very long and hard journey to be on as well. So if you are in an industry that is not perhaps receptive to your product, or is not receptive to your mindset, in the context of something like the circular economy, that's very hard to keep fighting against, fighting for funding, and so on. So I think seeing or highlighting best practice, highlighting real kind of North Stars in this, I think could be really exciting.
Wonderful. Other panelists?
Yeah, I'm happy to give maybe two things. One is there are two books or reports that I would pick up if you want some inspiration. When Citra just released 39 inspiring business models from around the world, or they're circular business models, of course, but they're really examples from frugal innovation to really high growth technology-enabled businesses to, things that are more kind of upstream that established businesses could acquire in their kind of view of kind of more venture capital or venture investing. But maybe to give another example, so Antonia gave a great example of what can happen in the kind of hub. We have another partner. We're happy to support Scale 360. Another partner, InView, who's working with IKEA Foundation, and what they're doing is they're taking kind of a problem set. So one example is with a program they have called Food Flow. They're looking at post-harvest loss of food. So just an example in the context of Kenya, that about 50% of harvested fruits and vegetables are lost before they reach the customer, right? So if you take that big problem and say, okay, let's go on a design principle to get to zero food loss in Kenya, take a few fruits and vegetable chains. This is always an issue. When you talk of fruits and vegetables, food, you always talk about value chains. So it's a way that technicians think, but to apply innovation to that, what they're doing is saying, let's get the businesses in and see where the loss is happening and start businesses all along that value chain where there are gaps. So you might have some solutions that are going to be long-term to get to profitability, some that maybe never make money, but they could be more of a public-private or even public sector run type enterprise. And really establishing and testing what the business models are. So the idea there isn't they're not coming in as a business to create the scalable business and optimize to profit margins immediately. They're coming to find out what is the possible model that could solve that specific problem on these different gaps in the value chain. And so at one point in time, you could look at the mango value chain, and maybe they're going to help initiate 3 or 4 different enterprises with local entrepreneurs to start those businesses. So they're helping find the capital, but also the entrepreneur to build around and give them that ownership and incentive. And I just think that's a really innovative approach to solving these really systemic problems. But again, it requires a mix of blended finance. So you've got to have some foundations in there who aren't looking for immediate economic returns or impact even. They're long on impact. And also you need governments in there involved who might also be longer on impact and more looking at social impacts as well.
Thank you very much, David. I just have a follow-up question for you. I mean, do you think that movement now is led mainly by corporates and big corporates and governments because they're under more pressure? What about the large swathe of SMEs that we see across the world? How are they responding to this circular economy movement?
I think, I think startups can also play an important role. SMEs, I mean, they have to be working with the government at the same time with the corporates. For example, governments can actually put some incentives in place for big corporates to use new technologies coming out from the startups, which makes their processes or their industry more energy efficient, more sustainable, and towards a circular economy. So another thing is the corporates, that they have money and resources, they can actually have a dedicated team or department to identify new technologies from startups that helps them actually to be more efficient. At the end of the day, it's going to be beneficial to them. So then they can actually source new technologies and try to actually do a quick pilot or trial with them. And if it works, they can actually continue to inject money and resources to make that happen at industrial scale for themselves. So I think it's a combination of a collaboration between government, the startups, and corporates.
Wonderful.
And if I can just add to that, Jessica, if you think about the plastics, right, movement as a really fascinating one, the challenge of plastic, single-use plastics and the impacts on the environment has been around for decades, right? So UNEP and a number of the agencies have been reporting on this, and scientists have been studying this. But it was really sort of in, I would say, 2016, 2017, that suddenly the sentiment changed in the public. There was a really kind of uptick in recognition that this was not something that people desired. It became visible, it became known. And let's say sort of 5-10 years before that, there were some early moving entrepreneurs who had already started kind of finding solutions for everything from new delivery models to better service customers, to not necessarily use kind of a single-use packaging model, to kind of alternative solutions to plastics, bio-based materials, etc. But actually, since 2017, 2018, when the big corporates and governments suddenly started to pay attention to this, you see a lot more funds, right? So Morgan Stanley even launched a big fund for circular economy. A lot of dedicated funds are going into supporting startups to find alternatives to plastics. So it's kind of, you always need your trailblazers, your early movers, and I think this is where the startup ecosystem begins to build some momentum. But actually, the tipping point also needs to come when you have the market buyers, as well as the policy and the finance available actually to scale those businesses, but also to actually incentivize more entrants into the market. So they play for me an incredibly important role, but in a sense, you need the other sort of conditions around entrepreneurs to facilitate that scale and success at the end of the day. It's not possible to kind of fight up against the curve forever. And I think Calum made the point that we then need to create actually systems that enable these entrepreneurs to connect to those players, to play their trailblazing role, to change the policy, to create the markets and systems as well. And I mean, we launched a platform called Uplink a year ago, which is all about that, is just create the space, completely open space for entrepreneurs to come in and communicate, but also get access to leaders to be able to help them, because it's really difficult otherwise, to be able to send those signals that actually we have solutions, but we need your help to invest, to buy, and to create the conditions as well.
I think you hit on a really interesting point on visibility, right? You talked about the plastics movement and how it became so visible. So let's talk about COVID a little, because COVID-19 has obviously been the biggest crisis that humanity has seen for a while. And I think that narrative that, it was a result of the unsustainable use of resources, deforestation, for example, clearing habitats in which increase the proximity between animals and humans, and then hence increasing zoonotic diseases. Do you think people are getting that link? Has it become so visible for people now that it will help the circular economy? Because as we've seen, it's actually killed the recycling plastic industry. But in this case, do you think COVID will help circular economy? Calum, perhaps I can come to you.
Definitely agree with your kind of premise there, that things like obviously increases in zoonotic diseases are very much linked to how we are engaging with the natural environment. I think sadly to some extent that world and that link is so far removed from the reality of COVID for many people that they're not making that connection. I think what is making a connection in some of the markets in which we're working is that you're seeing huge increases in e-commerce, huge increase in home delivery, and then a massive increase in waste and plastic and so on accompanied by that. I think that's a much more tangible entry point to start shifting local behavior. Although I think framing all this in a kind of more macro sense, in the sense of the impact of something like COVID or zoonotic diseases is important. I think sadly for behavior change, though, a lot of the time you have to make it very local and very real. And I think that's where looking at how we've shifted in terms of industry or enterprise is perhaps a good entry point.
Interesting. Any other speakers would like to jump in on the COVID-19 impact?
I can add specific examples about our case. So it was interesting that after COVID, we were expecting maybe we can get less customers on board, but it was vice versa. So we got more pilots and more customers and more interest from the industry. And I believe the reason is, when a lot of companies were heated by COVID badly, so they looked at the resources and their financials and all these things. So, and then they start thinking how they can even save more and become more, sustainable. And then they decided to move faster with these type of new solutions that help them to be more efficient. So that's why the deals was faster, the discussions went quite fast, and then we onboard quite a lot of customers after COVID.
I'm very happy to hear that. David, Antonia, do you have any thoughts on where you think the trajectory will go?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just building off of the point of COVID itself is, I don't know that COVID is a moment to leverage off on business opportunity, but I think what it does is it just further puts in further relief or highlight these systemic issues that pre-existed COVID. And that includes vulnerability to supply chain risk that companies and countries face, and the need for broader industry transitions to more sustainable approaches. So I think that's one. This is a silver lining, but it puts it, and we can emphasize that. I think the other is, like Calum's mentioning, there are these behavior changes that have shown to be really rapid. That could be built upon, even the use of remote healthcare, that creates a separation between your engagement with a physical product and a physical space to a virtual environment, which is the type of behavior change that's needed to move from buying products to using products as a service. So how can you think of that and help your customers understand, or your citizens understand, that it's not too radical then to take a step away from ownership of a car or ownership of your electronic technologies. So I think there's maybe a little hope in creating behavior change. But I don't know, my Facebook feed tells me a lot of different things, and the news tells me a lot of different things about perceptions. And I think we have a long way to go to really understand what's going to create the fundamental behavior changes in our society. But there's a lot of evidence of significant systems changes that have happened that can, in the past, that can give us hope, from learning to buckle our seatbelts when we ride in a car, to more healthy behaviors to help reduce our risk and exposure to health risks.
Thank you very much, David. Antonia?
Yeah, building on that, I think a dimension of this that COVID has certainly put a spotlight on is the kind of how fundamentally unsustainable the economics of a lot of our large-scale value chains are, and that is in particular connected to the workers in those value chains, which of course is connected to the pricing and and therefore sort of the fact that a lot of the externalities in our products are not accounted for. You know, you take again the fashion textiles industry as an example. You know, with the rapid kind of drop in demand, what happened was that there was quite millions of workers in countries who were let go without any social security safety net at all. And these are the workers that are producing the clothes that we wear half as long and throw away twice as quickly, and by double the amount of, as I mentioned at the beginning. So these things are of course connected, right? So if we have a system that through the pandemic has unearthed, let's say, the fundamental kind of unsustainable economic conditions that in the COVID context has hit the people, I would say, the most, that is, I think, a wake-up call for us to sort of look at the entire system to say, look, how do we rebuild this? How do we build this back in a way that is not only more sustainable for the individuals within that supply chain, but also, of course, therefore, the impacts on the environment. And you also in the circular economy can take a lot of the workers within the circular economy, the waste pickers who work in a lot of countries have, again, similarly become really, I think, brought to the fore with a recognition that they don't have the necessary equipment to be safe, but this is the livelihood that they still require to be able to sustain their families. And again, when you don't have the social security, you don't have the health systems and the support in place, what can we learn from that? So in a sense, I really take away from COVID, and I hope that we step back and look at the system that has been created and rethink actually the economics of it that ultimately, yes, impact the way that we're extracting resources from the environment, the incentives for the circular economy, but actually in a way as important are the individuals within that system who are suffering still incredibly as a result of COVID. And I think it's easy for us to forget about that when we sit in places like Europe, North America, where the systems are better. But again, it's that sort of, it's far away. So for me, I think that's a hope, at least that I have, that we won't forget that as well.
You make such good points, Antonia, and I think that making those connections are really important, and I hope that our discussion here today has helped people make those connections. With an eye on the time, we only have a couple of minutes left. I'd just like to invite the speakers to give just your parting thoughts. And the question that I want to pose to you is that if you had a magic wand, what is the one thing that you would change today that you think will accelerate the global economy? Farahani, I start with you.
Yeah, sure. Would like to change all the conventional energy-intensive separation processes that currently uses 15% of the world's energy with sustainable solutions that consumes 10 times less energy.
Fantastic. I like that. Very specific. David?
Yeah, I mean, mine's going to be the opposite of specific. I would like to see circular economy mainstreamed. And for me, that means things like seeing circular economy policies in like the Paris Agreement processes, so companies actually mentioning them in their NDC. I'd like to see more companies, maybe all of the Fortune 500 with circular economy as a fundamental principle in their sustainability plans. And maybe a circular unicorn.
What is that? Yeah, I think that day will come, right? We will see startups grow into huge companies, and I like your examples. Thank you. Calum?
I'll try and fit somewhere in between, in the middle there.
Okay.
So for me, particularly in the context of the SDGs, what's been an enormous catalyst to reducing poverty has been improved connectivity. So I would really want for a low cost and truly circular smartphone, which I think could be transformational in so many parts of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you, Calum. And last but not least, Antonia.
I guess I already have good news for David, because I have a circular unicorn in my house because I never buy new toys for my kids. So that one's done. I guess the other is maybe I'll go big. I mean, I'm an economist by training, and I think, you know, the sort of out there wish is always that we can price in properly, call it externalities, so that then actually when we're producing things, we are taking that into account from the very beginning of the system. And so how can we encourage governments and also companies to take actions to really think about internalizing those costs through internal corporate pricing mechanisms, or also government pricing mechanisms as well.
Wonderful. And on that note, I'd like to thank all you speakers for your wonderful participation there. I've learned so much from all of you, and I think we've had a really robust discussion that's gone from legislation to the global trends, as well as actual tools and resources that companies can use to, you know, on their journey to circular economy. So I really want to thank you for participating, and I hope we'll all stay engaged on this platform and on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.